We have still to tell of two other great men, Confucius and Lao Tse, who lived in that wonderful century which began the adolescence of mankind, the 6th century BC. In this history thus far we have told very little of the early story of China. At present that early history is still very obscure, and we look to Chinese explorers and archaeologists in the new China that is now arising to work out their past as thoroughly as the European past has been worked out during the last century. Very long ago the first primitive Chinese civilizations arose in the great river valleys out of the primordial Heliolithic culture. They had, like Egypt and Sumeria, the general characteristics of that culture, and they centered upon temples in which priests and priest-kings offered the seasonal blood sacrifices. The life in those cities must have been very like the Egyptian and Sumerian life of 6,000 or 7,000 years ago and very like the Maya life of Central America 1,000 years ago. If there were human sacrifices, they had long given way to animal sacrifices before the dawn of history. And a form of picture writing was growing up long before 1,000 years BC. And just as the primitive civilizations of Europe and Western Asia were in conflict with the nomads of the desert and the nomads of the north, so the primitive Chinese civilizations had a great cloud of nomadic peoples on their northern borders. There was a number of tribes akin in language and ways of living, who are spoken of in history and succession as the Huns, the Mongols, the Turks, and Tartars. They changed and divided and combined and recombined, just as the Nordic peoples in North Europe and Central Asia changed and varied in name rather than in nature. These Mongolian nomads had horses earlier than the Nordic peoples, and it may be that in the region of the Altai Mountains they made an independent discovery of iron someone after 1000 BC. And just as in the Western case so ever and again these Eastern nomads would achieve a sort of political unity, and become the conquerors and masters and revivers of this or that settled and civilized region. It is quite possible that the earliest civilization of China was not Mongolian at all any more than the earliest civilization of Europe and Western Asia was Nordic or Semitic. It is quite possible that the earliest civilization of China was a brunette civilization and of a piece with the earliest Egyptian, Sumerian and Dravidian civilizations, and that when the first recorded history of China began there had already been conquests and intermixture. At any rate we find that by 1750 BC China was already a vast system of little kingdoms and city-states, all acknowledging a loose allegiance and paying more or less regularly, more or less definite feudal dues to one great priest-emperor, the Son of Heaven. The Shang dynasty came to an end in 1125 BC. A Zhou dynasty succeeded Shang, and maintained China in a relaxing unity until the days of Asoka in India and of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Gradually China went to pieces during that long Zhou period. Hunnish peoples came down and set up principalities, local rulers discontinued their tribute and became independent. There was in the 6th century BC, says one Chinese authority, 5,000 or 6,000 practically independent states in China. It was what the Chinese call in their records an age of confusion. But this age of confusion was compatible with much intellectual activity and with the existence of many local centers of art and civilized living. When we know more of Chinese history we shall find that China also had her Miletus and her Athens, her Pergamum and her Macedonia. At present we must be vague and brief about this period of Chinese division simply because our knowledge is not sufficient for us to frame a coherent and consecutive story. Confucius. Confucius. Copy of stone carving in the Temple of Confucius at Kyifu. From the records of the Archaeological Mission to North China, Chavan. And just as in divided Greece there were philosophers and in shattered and captive Jewry prophets, so in disordered China there were philosophers and teachers at this time. In all these cases insecurity and uncertainty seem to have quickened the better sort of mind. Confucius was a man of aristocratic origin and some official importance in a small state called Lu. Here in a very parallel mood to the Greek impulse he set up a sort of academy for discovering and teaching wisdom. The lawlessness and disorder of China distressed him profoundly. He conceived an ideal of a better government and a better life, and traveled from state to state seeking a prince who would carry out his legislative and educational ideas. He never found his prince, he found a prince, but court intrigues undermined the influence of the teacher and finally defeated his reforming proposals. It is interesting to note that a century and a half later the Greek philosopher Plato also sought a prince, and was for a time advisor to the tyrant Dionysius who ruled Syracuse and Sicily. Confucius died a disappointed man. "No intelligent ruler arises to take me as his master," he said, "and my time has come to die." But his teaching had more vitality than he imagined in his declining and hopeless years, and it became a great formative influence with the Chinese people. It became one of what the Chinese call the three teachings, the other two being those of Buddha and of Lao Tse. The gist of the teaching of Confucius was the way of the noble or aristocratic man. He was concerned with personal conduct as much as Gautama was concerned with the peace of self-forgetfulness, and the Greek with external knowledge and the Jew with righteousness. He was the most public-minded of all great teachers. He was supremely concerned by the confusion and miseries of the world, and he wanted to make men noble in order to bring about a noble world. He sought to regulate conduct to an extraordinary extent, to provide sound rules for every occasion in life. A polite, public-spirited gentleman, rather sternly self-disciplined, was the ideal he found already developing in the northern Chinese world, and one to which he gave a permanent form. The Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China. As it crosses the mountains in Manchuria. Photo: Underwood and Underwood. The teaching of Lao Tse, who was for a long time in charge of the imperial library of the Zhou dynasty, was much more mystical and vague and elusive than that of Confucius. He seems to have preached a stoical indifference to the pleasures and powers of the world and a return to an imaginary simple life of the past. He left writings very contracted in style and very obscure. He wrote in riddles. After his death his teachings, like the teachings of Gautama Buddha, were corrupted and overlaid by legends and had the most complex and extraordinary observances and superstitious ideas grafted upon them. In China, just as in India, primordial ideas of magic and monstrous legends out of the childish past of our race struggled against the new thinking in the world and succeeded in plastering it over with grotesque, irrational, and antiquated observances. Both Buddhism and Taoism, which ascribes itself largely to Lao Tse, as one finds them in China now, are religions of monk, temple, priest, and offering of a type as ancient in form, if not in thought, as the sacrificial religions of ancient Sumeria and Egypt. But the teaching of Confucius was not so overlaid because it was limited and plain and straightforward and lent itself to no such distortions. Early Chinese bronze bell. Early Chinese bronze bell. Inscribed in archaic characters, made for use by the elder of Hing village in Ting district, latter half of the Zhou dynasty, 6th century BC. In the Victoria and Albert Museum. North China, the China of the Huanghe River, became Confucian in thought and spirit. South China, Yangtze-Kiang China, became Taoist. Since those days a conflict has always been traceable in Chinese affairs between these two spirits, the spirit of the North and the spirit of the South, between, in latter times, Pekin and Nanking, between the official-minded, upright and conservative North, and the skeptical, artistic, lax, and experimental South. The divisions of China of the Age of Confusion reached their worst stage in the 6th century BC. The Zhou dynasty was so enfeebled and so discredited that Lao Tse left the unhappy court and retired into private life. Three nominally subordinate powers dominated the situation in those days: TSI and TSN, both northern powers, and CHU, which was an aggressive military power in the Yangtze Valley. At last TSI and TSN formed an alliance, subdued CHU, and imposed a general treaty of disarmament and peace in China. The power of TSN became predominant. Finally, about the time of Asoka in India, the TSN monarch seized upon the sacrificial vessels of the Zhou emperor and took over his sacrificial duties. His son, Shi Huangti, king in 246 BC, emperor in 220 BC, is called in the Chinese chronicles the first universal emperor. More fortunate than Alexander, Shi Huangti reigned for 36 years as king and emperor. His energetic reign marks the beginning of a new era of unity and prosperity for the Chinese people. He fought vigorously against the Hunnish invaders from the northern deserts, and he began that immense work, the Great Wall of China, to set a limit to their incursions.